area looks secure. Hold still and I'll fix you up.
Movie tie-in games used to be an industry all unto themselves. If a film had any kind of appeal to young audiences, there was undoubtedly a tie-in video game released on every platform to varying degrees of quality. Universal wanted to partake in the tie-in boom, and proceeded to look back through their film catalogue for something to produce a tie-in to. 1982's The Thing appeared as a perfect candidate, and with the runaway success of Resident Evil and Silent Hill in the years prior, taking The Thing into a third-person survival horror game was an obvious choice. Unlike Resident Evil and Silent Hill, The Thing has a much greater emphasis on combat, with an impressively wide selection of weapons. The game's difficulty is entirely constructed around aiming the weapons. As the difficulty increases, the auto-aim cone becomes tighter. Aiming down the sights allows the player to move the reticle however they choose, which is occasionally helpful, but it is generally unnecessarily cumbersome on a PlayStation 2 controller. The player can also collect a party of NPCs to assist them as they investigate the ruins of Outpost 31. The NPCs can be one of three types that assist the player in progressing through the Antarctic wastes: the soldier, who is more effective at using weapons; the medic, who can heal the player and other NPCs without consuming health packs; and the engineer, who is capable of repairing more complex electrical boxes, which allow access to additional resources and save points. The player and their allies also take exposure damage from walking around outdoors, so keeping an eye out for somewhere warm is always necessary when exploring an outdoor level. These NPCs could also be thing creatures in disguise, and suspect the player of being an imposter, which is a fantastic mechanical idea, but the implementation is rarely interesting. In the film, the inhabitants of Outpost 31 became aware that the Thing creature is capable of copying another creature's DNA and making itself look like the original. This starts with a dog, but eventually the humans are being killed and replaced, and those who are still human must find a means to determine which of their colleagues are still who they appear. Eventually, MacReady figures that since the creatures would want to stay alive at all costs, they could burn a petri dish of the suspect's blood and observe if the blood leaped from the dish to escape destruction. This kind of thing is somewhat replicated within the game. The player can find items that can determine if they or another are human. The game even lifts the "here's what I already know" line from the movie.
You got the kit? Good. The report said the hypo contains a chemical that reacts with blood. Do it. We'll soon know, one way or another.
Now I'm gonna show you what I already know.
If an NPC suspects that the player is not human, they will not follow orders given to them, and can eventually become hostile towards the player. Giving the NPC a weapon, or testing yourself in front of them, can earn their trust, but I cannot think of a reason why I wouldn't give an NPC a weapon. If an NPC is not human, they will not turn on the player in human form, nor will they randomly turn into a thing creature and attack. The NPCs that aren't human will only transform when they die, or at scripted locations, so there is never a reason to test them. Even if they aren't human, they will continue to carry out their role and will fight with the player against other creatures. It would be disadvantageous for the player to confirm if an NPC isn't human, so I never used the tests. I mentioned before that I played on PlayStation 2, and the game's visuals certainly look that way, despite the image quality being surprisingly good. The environments lack small details and can have basic layouts, but the textures haven't aged out of being acceptable just yet. The game is especially dark though, and in order to present a video where the gameplay can actually be seen, I was forced to use the light item for almost the entire game. If there were locations with excellent lighting or a dank mood, I missed it because the overall darkness of the game. There are so many twisting corridors and a near permanent snowstorm occurring outdoors that render distance was never an issue. But there was a portion in the subaquatic base where the frame rate tanked. This was the only issue that I had with the frame rate. However, some of the cinematics had audio-visual desyncs, but considering the 20-year-old character models and 20-year-old lip syncing, it was hard to interpret the events within the cinematics as dramatic. Thankfully, this game released before the epidemic that was QuickTime event final bosses. Instead, the game ends with a turret section that is wholly unlike anything else in the game. Controlling the game is also a product of the time. There are 3 preset controller layouts, which include the now standard left stick movement, right stick pivot, but it feels kind of unnatural. I preferred the left stick tank control, right stick strafe, because of the way aiming down sights is handled. Aiming controls don't change with the presets. The only way to control the reticle is with inverted Y-axis, standard X-axis controls on the left stick, with leaning and zooming on the right. Whenever it was necessary to aim at something, explosive hazards, the target is too far for the auto-aim to select it, or any time the sniper rifle was in use, I found that I totally lost sense of the control scheme. Even in the penultimate level I was still struggling to aim effectively, and being killed by enemies I feel as though I would have killed had the controls been consistent. Upon death, the player is given the option to restart the level or return to the main menu, despite there being multiple save points between the start of the level and where the player died. The player can load from a save point, but they have to return to the main menu and load the entire level again whenever they die. Moreover, the game doesn't save at the start of a level. If the player finishes a level and wants to stop playing just after the next level begins, they will need to play through that level until they reach another save point before they can save. Some levels don't have save points at all, and the player might need to repeat large sections of gameplay through a long, arduous level. There is some charm to be found, and some generally well-crafted horror sequences that make playing The Thing worthwhile. The initial suspense of rummaging through Outpost 31 in search of evidence for what occurred there is thick and intriguing. Then, after the player moves to the Norwegian outpost, with a pair of allies they picked up along the way, it is revealed that they are both imposters, and the ensuing panic is unique to this game. Later on, the player is captured and taken across the continent to another research facility. When there, the player is knocked unconscious and left on a table without any of their weapons or items. The facility is then overtaken by creatures, and the player must find a means to escape. Limiting resources offers a fresh challenge, and the environment is completely original. While the subaquatic base isn't especially fun, there is an enemy ambush that is expertly set up and paid off upon, without any kind of audio sting. I was absolutely floored when this happened, and the fact that it only happens once made this moment even more special. There are some other areas in the game that are special, but in a less complimentary way. A few times, the game will force the player into a scenario that they must try to solve. In the warehouse level, the player encounters a large creature type that is somewhat gorilla-ish and is resistant to fire damage. Fire is required to kill large creatures, and they will move away from sources of fire. But if they take reduced damage from fire, then killing them is a difficult task. Further into the warehouse, the player must kill 3 of these gorilla enemies at once, and they are accompanied by a swarm of smaller creatures. Furthermore, the player must also keep an NPC character alive during this encounter, whose death will cause the player to have to restart the level. When the player finishes in the research facility and is ready to escape, they cause the building to start exploding. As they flee, there are various pipes on the path out that will explode when the player crosses a trigger point. So the ideal strategy to escape an exploding building is to slowly inch your way up the escape route, so you aren't killed by standing too close to a lethal pipe rupture. Then there's the bosses. In total, there are 4 boss encounters throughout the game, and I would argue that only one of them is of any quality at all. The first 2 bosses are the same, with a slight alteration to their puzzle solution. These 2 are like plant creatures extending from the ground. They can't move, and both are battled in tiny rooms that they can't reach all the way across. The solution to the first boss is simply to stand in the corner and shoot at it. It will eventually become susceptible to fire damage. The second boss is very similar in design, except the player must run across the room to activate a button that shocks the creature, which then makes it vulnerable to attack. The third is a creature that hangs from the ceiling. It swings wildly if the player is standing at the edge of the room, but if the player is directly underneath it, the boss has no answer. While I am reminded of the large plant boss from the first Resident Evil game, I don't really understand how or why these enemies came to be, or why fighting them is even necessary. The fourth boss is the turret section at the end of the game, and while it is significantly better than the other 3, it is definitely competing with a low bar. This fight isn't without its problems, but it is the easiest of the 4, so it doesn't stick around for very long. Why it is also a gigantic plant arm creature thing is a mystery to me. There are many things about the way this game treats the Thing creatures that are mysteries to me. In the film, the creatures were aliens that were excavated from beneath the permafrost, thawed, and then began killing and replacing the life around it. They did this by assimilating their DNA with the target. The target was killed when this happened. So the way the game refers to people as being infected doesn't line up with how it was handled before. The creatures aren't infections. They're replicas that are aggressively self-preservant. The evil organization is using the Thing DNA to try to revive dead tissues, as if they're some kind of zombie phenomenon. The leader of that organization claims that he is infected, but is capable of controlling the infection. Again, this doesn't make any sense when the creatures are killing and replacing their victims. What infection do you have? Of course you can control it. You aren't a human. Then, that leader is seen coughing and stumbling before his body twists and morphs into the giant final boss enemy without immediate threat. But while he is in human form, he demonstrates that he is immune to fire. So when the player uses explosive barrels to defeat him, even that is inconsistent. Where does all of this infection stuff come from? I read every computer terminal in the game, and none of them hint at this kind of thing. It isn't until the bad guy is talking to a scientist that the whole infection part comes up. Why is it an infection? Overall, I enjoyed this game. It has silly quirks and some brutally frustrating sections, but the joy I found far outweighs these problems. The developer, Computer Artworks, went under partway through the development of a sequel, which is criminal in my opinion. Dead Space wasn't going to be released for another 6 years, so it would have been the perfect stopgap in that time, but maybe it was for the best. Next time, I'll look at a more classic traditional horror setting. It has vampires and zombies and fishmen. I expect it to be a cracking good time.